So today we will have like the pleasure to have Tomasz Piasecki with us. Tomasz is a financial risk manager who has been working in investment banking and also in central banks, responsible for sensitivity and scenario analysis. He's one of the first risk professionals holding the sustainability and climate risk designation, which is developed by the Global Association of Risk Professionals. So this is also a sign that the finance and the economic world is taking into account risk management and climate risk more seriously, and build up also some tools and some analytics to do some stress testing and scenario analysis. So I think it's great to have like Tomasz today with us. He will discuss about like how financial regulators tackle climate risk. Financial regulators are one of the key actors, I think, in terms of regulation today of climate. Clearly, there are a lot of institutions today dealing with climate. You have like United Nations, you have like the GIEC and the IPCC group, you have like even like courts of justice are also part of the regulation today, because you see that there are claims on court to attack countries which are not doing enough climate. So there are a lot of regulatory initiatives, but I would say that the financial regulators are trying to move forward quickly, because they consider also that the impact that they can receive by not acting now, and based on the scenario, and that would be, I think, part of the discussion we will have, like the future scenario. We cannot have business as usual. So we need really to change not only the financial industry, but our whole economy and our whole social infrastructure. So this is a massive shift, I think, for the financial industry, and they need to drive this process instead of just being like a passive actor. So that's there is an increased awareness of the emergency. So I will leave the floor to Tomasz, and as usual, please include your comments, remarks, questions in the chat. And we will take them, and then you can speak out and discuss. And now Tomasz is working for UBS, which is like one of the largest in Switzerland, and I think also he will give us also the European view about the financial regulations, and also from a bank perspective.
Okay, thank you very much, Arnaud. Bonsoir and good evening to everyone. Thank you for this warm welcome. So Arnaud gave a brief summary of my background. I will just reiterate that I have experience from the Central Bank of Poland working in financial regulation. I work for Credit Suisse in market risk management, sensitivity analysis, scenario analysis from the market risk perspective. And now I'm working as a climate risk manager. And I'm mainly dealing with stress tests and scenario analysis on a high level coming from the major financial regulators. So I'm hoping that I'm up to date with what's going on in the space of climate risk. So the topic of today's webinar, it's climate change and financial regulation, how financial regulators tackle climate risks. We will stay together up until 7, So here is a rough agenda for what I would like to do today. So I think we will give ourselves time until 5:55. Then we will have a 2-3 minutes break to grab some water, maybe go for a minute to the toilet or whatever. And up until that time, I would like to cover 4 topics. I will start with climate change, what climate change is. Then we will move to the notion of climate risk, how it's understood by the financial sector. Then we will speak about two important international institutions, the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative and the Network for Greening the Financial System. We will look at what's European Commission doing on green finance and climate risk, climate change, financial regulation. After the small break, we will look into what's actually going on right now in the European Banking Authority in terms of climate regulation, and we will look at the Prudential Regulation Authority from the Bank of England. The PRA is a front runner in terms of stress testing right now, so we will have a look at what PRA is doing right now in this space. By the end, we will leave some time for questions and answers. Arnaud already mentioned that you can write down questions, but I think that during that time you can also speak out and we can have a discussion. So let's begin. I hope you can all see the full screen. Please let me know.
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So let's start with climate change and the topic of global threat, actually what climate change is. I will give you a little bit of historical background, and this will allow us to understand what the financial regulators are doing right now and why they're doing it at this point of time, not before or not in the next decades. So very basic information. Climate change that was identified as a global problem actually some time ago, because in the mid 20th century, in 1957, there was an international geophysical year. About 30,000 scientists gathered at this venue with 70 countries discussing research on Earth science. After this meeting, the first permanent CO2 monitoring station was built in Hawaii. So in the 50s, there was some understanding of the idea of global warming and the impact of greenhouse gases, CO2 mainly, on global warming. And one interesting thing is that the first scientist who estimated the scope of warming was a Swedish scientist, Mr. Svante Arrhenius. And as you can see down here, he estimated the scope of warming from widespread coal burning. So at the time, they were mainly considered about coal. And he wrote that burning coal would bring more equable and better climates, especially as regards the colder regions of the Earth. So at the time, some of the scientists were aware of the phenomenon of global warming, but as a European scientist coming from northern countries, the scientists thought that actually it might not be so bad to have this global warming, because a lot of cold countries in Europe would just get a little bit warmer. So there was some understanding at the time. Then we have, since the 1950s, there was a lot of conferences, meetings, gatherings, international gatherings. And I picked the most important ones, the ones that actually put some influence on understanding or political action in the space of climate change, climate warming. So in 1972, there was a UN conference on the human environment, and that was the first large-scale summit on the global environment. At the time, a UN environmental program was established at the conference. The term climate change appeared for the first time in official documents. They have written that governments should be mindful of activities in which there is a risk of effects on climate. So this was back in 1972. 7 years later, there was the first World Climate Conference, and after this conference, a joint declaration of scientists was made, and they stated that continued expansion of man's activities on Earth may cause significant extended regional and even global changes of climate. After the 70s, the 80s came, and we can call this period to be a period of major diplomatic issues, causing serious disputes over climate. And the Villa Conference in 1985, this conference is regarded as a turning point. At the conference, the members of the conference were emphasizing the need for political action on climate. The conferences and meetings that took place before were mainly scientific in nature, so they were interesting to the scientists. But at the time, the politicians were not so much and not so much stressed because of the climate change phenomenon. The joint statement after the Villa Conference was given. An unprecedented rise in temperature is expected in the first half of the 21st century. So in 1985, the things that we are to some extent experiencing right now were modeled, right? Were expected at the time. Toronto Conference, 1988. That was the first conference to call for international framework convention to protect the atmosphere and set targets for greenhouse gas emissions. So the different countries started to think that, okay, once we have this science, now it's time to create an international framework convention to start acting on this. So some kind of document, international document that would enforce the reduction of GHG emissions. In 1990, there was the first release of the report of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So this is something that you already covered. And countries agreed in this report that CO2 is the major cause of global warming. At the time, this report was not stating that the global warming is caused only by anthropogenic GHG emissions, but they managed to agree that CO2 in general is the major cause of global warming. In 1992, there was a very important Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. At the time, the members adopted the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. It was ratified by 50 countries on March 21, 1994. We see in the next years, we see further issues, diplomatic issues, disputes, actually arising disputes on the notion of climate change and on the notion of any agreement on how to reduce the GHG emissions. And in 1997, we had the Conference of the Parties in Kyoto. It is a famous conference because of the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol, and most of us connect the Kyoto Protocol to measures taken to reducing the gases that cause the depletion of the ozone layer, right? And that was a successful part of the Kyoto Protocol, but the unsuccessful part of the Kyoto Protocol was the bit about reduction of greenhouse gases causing global warming. At the time, there was a division between two sets of countries, Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries. The Annex 1 countries were the developed countries, that by the protocol were forced to reduce their GHG emissions by 5% below the 1990 levels between 2008-2020. Of course, this did not happen. The emissions rose almost twice since that time. And there was an issue of developing countries. So there was a very large discussion on what should be the responsibility of developed countries, and should the developing countries be also responsible for reducing GHG emissions. The main argument was that the developed countries became developed because of burning fossil fuels, mainly coal. So here we are talking about the industrial revolution. So the development of such nations as United States, France, Belgium, Germany, all of these countries developed by burning and getting energy from coal in the 19th century. And the developing countries, obviously, since they started developing at a much later point in time, they also wanted to develop, and the major source of energy at the time, so in the 20th century, it was still coal, oil, fossil fuels in general. So these countries were exempted from any reductions, and the developed countries decided, at least the European countries decided to reduce their GHG emissions. At the time, there was a first big disagreement between EU, European countries, and US on operational aspects, and this resulted in US withdrawing from the Kyoto Protocol in 2001. EU and other developed countries continued working on climate issues, so the Kyoto Protocol was still running, but without US. And every time US withdrew from something, a lot of countries followed. So that was a major blow to this international agreement. In 2005, we had the Conference of the Parties. This abbreviation comes from the fact that this is the Conference of the Parties. So Conference of the Parties to the protocol in Montreal. In 2005, there was the Montreal Action Plan. And during the meeting at Montreal, the members discussed climate issues after Kyoto, and there were two major tracks to be taken. The first track was to continue with the Kyoto Protocol by running the second round of Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol was limited in time, so there was a set date when certain targets were to be met, and after this point in time, another round was expected to take place. So one idea was to extend the Kyoto Protocol, and the second idea was to actually take a new track. The new track was the UNFCCC, the climate change track, and there was the question of bringing back US and the rest of the world to solve the climate issue. So there was a question: is there a point of continuing with Kyoto Protocol if a lot of major economies do not want to be part of the Kyoto Protocol? That was one question. The second question: if that is not a good way forward, then another track should be developed. And this was the Montreal Action Plan. In 2006, release of the fourth report of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This release brought new and strong evidence on the link between greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And the United Nations Secretary General said that the report puts any skepticism left on whether climate change was real and happening off. So for those who read the report and agreed on the report, it was evident that we see something like climate change, and there is no doubt that this is a global problem. Then we have the time of the Paris Agreement. So the recent times, the climate change was readdressed during that period, and the climate change comes back as a major global concern. In 2009 in Copenhagen at the 15th Conference of the Parties, US along with China, Brazil, India, and South Africa pushed for an alternative political agreement, the Copenhagen Accord, that was a flexible bottom-up climate solution with voluntary pledges to GHG emission reduction. So this Copenhagen Accord built the fundament for the Paris Agreement. And what's interesting, this Copenhagen Accord was pushed by and developed by US and China, so the countries that were not the signatories of the Kyoto Protocol. So they were the fathers of this accord. At the time, the target of a maximum global average temperature rise of 2 degrees was set for the first time. So that's the first time that such a target appears globally. And thanks to the Copenhagen Accord in 2015, the world was ready to adopt the Paris Agreement. And that was a major breakthrough. It was a major diplomatic success. When you think of the numbers, 2015, the first science on the impact of global greenhouse gas emissions and the connection with climate change was in the 1950s, 1960s. So how much time actually passed before an agreement, full international agreement was reached? So 60, 70 years. The Paris Agreement followed a new logic of international climate politics, and it combined both bottom-up and top-down elements. We're gonna speak a little bit more later on this. All states had submitted voluntary targets for GHG emission reductions in the form of intended nationally determined contributions. Unlike Kyoto, the Paris Agreement did not enforce any hard targets. So that was the main change, that the international agreement was not enforcing anyone to reduce emissions by a certain amount. So that was not the goal. Here, signatories were expected to take responsibility for keeping the global average temperature rise below 2 degrees. What's interesting, after all of these countries, signatories, provided they intended nationally determined contributions, the outcome was not 2 degrees, but more than 3 to 4 degrees. So taking into account all of the INDCs, the world pledged to, in fact, to limit the temperature rise to 3-4 degrees instead of 2 degrees. So that was not enough. All actors were expected to be involved under the Paris Agreement. So up until 2010s, when everyone thought of climate issue and solving climate issues, it was mainly about governments. So it was due to governments to decide on what to do with GHG reductions, and of course it was not easy because political administration changed with different view on this topic, and it was very, very difficult to create a situation where all of the governments in the world are keen to limit GHG emissions. So here under Paris Agreement, all actors were expected to be involved. So the government, the private sector, and here we have the financial sector, which I will cover in a few minutes, and the civil society. So all of us, in fact, should take responsibility for limiting the temperature rise, the global temperature rise. In 2016, 1 year after Paris, rules and guidelines were written and agreed. The central role of non-state actors in the post-Paris international climate regime was reaffirmed. So again, the private sector, the NGOs, the civil society, these were the players to take part in reducing emissions and fighting climate change. Unluckily, in 2017, US decided to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. This came with the new administration, the Republican administration under Donald Trump, and all of the federal involvement in the Paris Agreement was stopped. What's interesting, the fathers of the Paris Agreement, those who gave the idea of this agreement, a lot of these people came from US, right? That was the US administration. So US withdrew from something that they proposed themselves to the world. Some of the non-federal actors decided to stick to their commitments. So when we think of US, we should not forget that some states like California decided to continue with obligations to the Paris Agreement. California hosted the Global Climate Action Summit in September 2018. And when you think about climate change, new climate-related technology, a lot of this technology comes from the states that actually decided to continue with fighting climate issues. In 2018, there was a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees. So the Paris Agreement assumes that the world should do everything to limit the global average temperature rise to 2 degrees. A special report came out stating that it would be much more beneficial to the society and the economy to limit the rise to 1.5 degrees. It highlighted the benefits of taking action to limit global warming, and it said that it's technically possible, but requires rapid and far-reaching transition in all aspects of the economy and society. Only a handful of countries refused to accept the report's findings. That was the US, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Kuwait, so the main extractors of fossil fuels. So after the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, Europe, which was always very involved in climate issues, decided to follow with its own plan, the European Green New Deal. And this deal commits EU members to lower its GHG emissions to net zero by 2050. A new coalition of countries called the Climate Ambitious Coalition emerged, consisting of 73 countries and 1,214 non-state actors. So since that time, when you look at different coalitions, they will also state they will not only state countries, but they will also state non-state actors. So a lot of corporations, NGOs, etc., who play a very important role in the economy and the society. So this is part of the change that that was brought with the Paris Agreement. So that's the story, the history. Here you can see this comes from the European Commission's website. A little information on the European Green Deal action plan. So it aims to boost the efficient use of resources by moving to a clean circular economy, restore biodiversity, and cut pollution. So the European Green Deal extends over the climate change issues. So it's not only about climate change, it's also about other environmental issues such as the biodiversity loss So the European Commission and the European Union looks at the whole problem from a much broader perspective, from the ESG perspective, environmental perspective, and it wants to deal with this at once. So not only deal with the notion of climate and climate change, but also with other aspects of environment degradation caused by human activity. The plan outlines investments needed and financing tools available. It explains how to ensure a just and inclusive transition. The EU aims to be climate neutral in 2050, so something that I already mentioned. It proposed a new climate law to turn this political commitment into a legal obligation, right? So the EU has power to enforce law over its members, and it will continue with doing that. For those who come from Europe, you know that certain countries oppose this Green New Deal. One of those, it's Poland, so the country that I come from. And this is mainly due to our energy mix. So Poland is one of the worst situations. It actually gets almost 80% of energy from coal. So this is one of the reasons why such a country like Poland opposes such a quick transition. Reaching this target will require action by all actors of our economy. So again, this comes to the idea of Paris Agreement, that all actors take part in the change, investing in environmentally friendly technologies, supporting industry to innovate, rolling out cleaner, cheaper, and healthier forms of private and public transport, decarbonizing the energy sector, ensuring buildings are more efficient, working with international partners. And the EU will also provide financial support and technical assistance to help those that are most affected by the move towards the green economy. This is called the Just Transition Mechanism. It will help mobilize at least 100 billion over the period 2001-2027 in the most affected regions, so not only in Europe. On the right, you can see the timeline. So it was implemented in December 2019, so fairly not so long ago, and there are a lot of different points and different aspects of this to work on. I will not read this out loud. You can have a look. And now, what is climate change? I hope I have not, just let me check. Yes, okay. Oh, sorry. So what is climate change? What is climate risk? What is climate risk? We already know what climate change is. And climate change is expected to bring both opportunities and risks. When we think from the global economy perspective, we can think of climate change as a severe structural change. So what we mean by a structural change, it is a dramatic shift in country, market, or industry operation. It is often accompanied by technological innovation, shifts in capital and labor pools, change in supply and demand for resources, products, services, geopolitical turmoil, organizational reforms, etc. So the world went through many structural changes in the past, but this one is unique. This one is unique because it's global. It affects the planet, and it's happening rapidly. It's happening rapidly, and the whole world, in the way we know it, will change fast. Of course, the Earth. I'm not going to go deeply into climate science. We know from the data that the climate changed very frequently on the planet, but it has never been caused by this kind of rapid destruction and disruption and such a quick release of CO2 into the atmosphere. So the world will be changing. A lot of elements of the world that we know right now will be changing, and that's why we can think of it as a severe structural change. What are the climate opportunities? When we think about climate opportunities, we distinguish resource efficiency. So we assume that the world and the world production will become much more efficient. There will be much less waste. And because of this whole project of becoming sustainable, this connects to sustainable growth and sustainable economy, that the world will simply become more resource efficient. We will not be losing so much resources. Energy sources, we will change the energy sources, so the world will switch to clean energy sources. New products will appear, new services will appear as well. Along with new products and new services, new markets will come, and the world will be in general more resilient. So it will be resilient to other shocks and other risks. This will also include, if it goes according to the plan, to the Paris Agreement, the international cooperation will increase, and there will be quite a lot of benefits of this whole climate change problem issue. But of course, this is in theory. With opportunities, there are also risks, and these are much more problematic. So in literature, we distinguish between two major areas in climate risks. The first one is the one that comes first to our mind, the physical risks. And the physical risk, we divide them into acute risks. So risks driven by events, disasters such as hurricanes, cyclones, floods. So we can think of Hurricane Katrina as a acute risk caused by climate change. When we look at the models expect hurricanes to appear, but with climate change, the frequency and severity of hurricanes is expected to increase. So we will still see hurricanes, but we will see more of them and more acute. So here we have the acute risk. The second bunch of risks, the chronic risks and the physical risks, these are much more problematic to the economy, and they connect well with the structural change notion. So these are the long-term shifts in climate patterns that may cause such permanent changes as sea level rise, regular deadly heat waves, and desertification. We already see this. So there is a group of countries called small island countries. They have their own representation under the United Nations, and these countries are preparing for the sea level rise. So the top points in these countries are the top latitudes are at 2 meters, for example. So the top latitude at the island is 2 meters. So if there is a change of 1 to 10 centimeters a year, it really affects those countries, which is also important to remember with regards, for example, to sea level rises. Even though we might not see the sea level rise, we might not see a drastic sea level rise in the next 100 years. We might see more flooding. So when you have times of the year when the tide is higher, these islands might be flooded temporarily. So for example, for a month, for 2 months, or these periods of flooding may extend. So all of this comes with climate change. Regular deadly heat waves. So this is something we already see in Australia. So parts of Australia that are hit by heat waves. And because of these heat waves, vegetation just dies, just dies. So all of these plants and animals, they are by default, by nature, they are prepared to withstand a number of days of heat. But if this heat wave is prolonged, then unfortunately all of these plants and animals die. So some kind of pattern is being distorted. And then desertification, a huge problem in Africa and Asia. And because of desertification, we expect a lot of geopolitical risks. So people migrating off the desertified land. And since borders are fixed, we might see millions of people moving out of borders. So basically, we might see climate migrants. So this is a big issue. So physical risks, acute, chronic. Next ones. Okay, let's wait for my. Okay, I hope that's the next one. So before we go to transition risks, let's have a look at this map. That's the map of global average temperatures, how they are expected to increase between how they are expected to increase by 2050. And one important thing to remember is that when we talk about the average temperature rise, we are talking about, as I said, about the average, right? So the change in temperature might be distributed completely differently across the world. So we might see parts of the world that will not actually experience a major change in temperature, but we might see parts of the world that will experience, for example, 7 degrees change in temperature, in the yearly temperature. And 7 degrees change in the yearly temperature, it means that the climate of this particular region changes completely, right? And this is only by 2050. So the pace of it is unprecedented, and all of the actors, including the financial sector, are very sort of afraid of this, right? What could be the real consequence of such global climate changes? Transition risks. So these are the risks. So these are the main risks, actually, that the financial sector and we as consumers will be facing. So before the chronic risks, the physical chronic risks materialize, some time may pass. So what really is of interest to us and to the financial sector right now is the transition risk. The first bunch of risks under transition risk are the policy and legal risks. So adaptation and mitigation policies at the international and state level, litigation claims for failing to mitigate or adapt to the consequences of climate change. So everything that, so for example, the European Green Deal, this is an example of policy risk. So 20 years ago, probably nobody thought that there would be something like a Green New Deal, and that Europe would describe its strategy around such an issue. Of course, from a consumer standpoint, this might not be a major problem. It also depends on what sort of investments we are making. If we decide on what holidays we want to go, we probably decide a few months ahead. But if we decide, for example, about such an investment as buying a house or a flat, this becomes this becomes problematic, and we are affected by certain risks. Risks in this case, the policy and legal risks. So the legal risk, this is something that might appear, everyone is expecting this, that in the future a lot of corporations would start suing governments for not taking action and not trying to mitigate the consequences of climate change. So a very important part of transition risk, the policy and legal risk. Technology risk, so new technologies replacing old fossil fuel based technologies. Why is it so important? Why is this risk so dangerous? So for example, let's assume that a corporation, maritime corporation that focuses on transport, invests in diesel cargo ships, and if the lifespan of such a ship is 20 years, it might be the case that in the next 10 years this ship might become a stranded asset. I will talk more about this. So if we invest in something that is based on an old technology, we might have to write off this investment at a much earlier date, and a new technology might come in, and those firms, those corporations that have the funds to invest in these new technologies, they will be ahead of the market. Then we have the market risk, so shifts in demand and supply for commodities, products and services, revaluation of assets again. So for example, we have the market, the stock market, for example, and we have a lot of corporations that have various assets, and these assets have a certain value, and the whole valuation of this company is based in part on these assets. And it might be the case that the climate change brings change to the valuation of those assets, and then we see a disruption on the stock market because the investors are not valuing a particular firm in the way they used to. Reputational risk, changes in customer and community perception. So for example, there might be a very quick change in how customers look at certain products. People might move to products that are eco-friendly, that are biologically produced. So these kind of things, and if you are a firm and you do not take these changes into consideration, then you might fall under the trap of reputational risk. Now, financial impacts from climate risk. A good quote from Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock. The evidence on climate risk is compelling investors to reassess core assumptions about modern finance in the future, and sooner than most anticipate, there will be a significant reallocation of capital. And you might know that BlackRock is the largest asset manager in the world, so it has a few trillion dollars under management. And if the CEO of the largest asset manager in the management firm in the world says something like this, then it means that the issue of climate change is really is starting to be taken very seriously by the financial industry. Up to recent times, climate risks were not included in most of asset valuations. So this is something that I already mentioned. The wider notion of environmental, social, and governance factors was treated as an externality, so a cost or benefit caused by a producer that is not financially incurred or received by the producer. Greenhouse gas emissions that cause the anthropogenic global warming are now considered to be negative externalities. In order to correct for market failure, negative externalities need to be correctly priced by markets and via taxes. So you all probably heard about negative externalities and the notion of externality. So something that should be included in the price of a product or service, but for some reason was not. And this comes from Mr. Pigou in the 1920s. He developed this theory, and this theory is applied to many environmental issues. So for example, the issue of polluting water, of polluting air. Nobody pays for that, so the producers do not pay for polluting air and water. And the cost of their product, the price of their product, does not include those externalities. So one way to do that is to impose tax, and this is what many countries in the world do. When they see a market failure, they just introduce taxes on certain things. Or it might be the case, like with the climate change, that the market itself realizes that it's pricing certain assets, certain products, services incorrectly, and it might correct for this market failure to some extent itself. And this is what's happening right now. So we see revaluation of many things of the world, many corporations, plants, production facilities, etc. So this is being reevaluated right now. Here we have a graphic from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. I will speak about it in a minute. So here again, we see the risks, we see the transition risks, we see the opportunities. They come into the strategic planning and risk management of a particular firm. Then we have the financial impact, and we can think of financial impacts from these risks and opportunities, and we can think of these financial impacts on three major sort of ways of describing the financial position. So we have the income statement, the cash flow statement, and the balance sheet. So I already mentioned about the assets, so revaluing assets. So it might be the case that we are incorrectly valuing some of our assets. For example, the diesel cargo ship, the firm owns a number of diesel cargo ships. That's an asset. This has to be revalued, right? Because in the next few years, a new technology might come in, a new policy might come in saying that these ships are no longer allowed to be used because of emission standards, and this asset has to be written off. The same for liabilities. So the other side, capital and financing. So would a bank finance a corporation that only owns diesel cargo ships? Probably it would not be easy to get financing from a bank for such a corporation. And the value of capital again. So what consists the capital of a firm, and what's the real price of this capital, value of this capital? Then we have the income statement, so revenues and expenditures. Revenues, for example, our firm, the firm that we invested, gets revenue from selling for example, diesel cars, or if we go out from this example, for example, sells something that is not eco-friendly, or maybe some food that is not considered healthy. For example, sells coffee that is not fair traded. And by changes in the market, by changes in behavior of the customers, this firm might see their revenues going down. Expenditures, this firm might need to buy some commodity on the international market. There might be a disruption to this market, to the price of the commodity, and then all of these would affect the income statement. So you might think of these risks, and there are many examples you can think for yourself of these examples, but it's important to bear in mind on how these risks and opportunities affect these different reports. Okay. Now, financial disclosures. So in order to fully grasp climate risks, the financial sector needs to understand those risks and properly disclose them. In order to facilitate this process, the Financial Stability Board, which is a major international body that monitors and makes recommendations about the global financial system, it was established by the G20. It's based in Switzerland. Members of central banks, governments, financial ministries, they gather at the Financial Stability Board. Some of them work at the Financial Stability Board, and they give recommendations to the global financial system. So a lot of proposals about guidelines, regulations, they come from the Financial Stability Board. Thanks to that, a lot of standards and regulations, they're pretty the same around the world, because it was first agreed within the Financial Stability Board and then implemented in various regional institutions. The FSB formed the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, whose mission is to provide recommendations to the global financial sector. So when you think about those risks from the previous slide, a very important notion is how to force or how to invite the world's corporations, the world firms, financial firms, but also the corporations from all of the industries in the world, to disclose their climate, their climate stance, the risks that they are facing. Obviously, you might not expect a major fossil fuel extractor and producer to disclose all of the climate risks and all of the harm that it makes. And this task force on climate-related financial disclosures was formed in order to help facilitate that. And by setting an international standard and by inviting national regulators to make use of these recommendations and incorporate those recommendations into national laws, more and more corporations might finally disclose their risks properly. And this is what the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure is created for, and the aim is to finally arrive at a proper disclosure of climate-related financial risks. So let's go quickly for this one. Recommendations, 4 widely adaptable recommendations tied to governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. So the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, divides recommendations into 4 main areas. So the governance, this is the board of directors. So there are certain recommendations to the board of directors that the board of directors should be aware of climate risk. They should have parts of the members of the board aware of climate risk, responsible for climate risk. There should be enough resources targeted at the climate risk disclosure and management. Then there are recommendations towards the strategy. So firms, the corporations, the financial corporations, firms, they should include the notion of climate risk, climate change into their strategy. So they should take into account the climate risks. Then risk management, so how particular firms deal with climate risk from the risk management perspective, and what metrics and targets are are used. Recommended disclosures, specific recommended disclosures. Organizations should include in their financial filings to provide decision useful information, guidance providing context and suggestions for implementing the recommended disclosures for all organizations. So this is what we can find in this document. Here again, core elements of recommended climate-related financial disclosures, as I said: governance, the organization's governance around climate-related risks and opportunities, the strategy, the actual and potential impacts of climate-related risks and opportunities on the organization's business, strategy, and financial planning, risk management, the process used by the organization to identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks, metrics and targets, the metrics and targets used to assess and manage relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. There are 7 principles for effective disclosures. Let's go through them quickly. First, disclosures should represent relevant information. So these are the principles. So all of the corporations around the world, they see this document, and this is how they are recommended to follow with their disclosures. And these are the principles. So the first one: disclosures should represent relevant information, should be specific and complete, should be clear, balanced, and understandable, should be consistent over time, should be comparable among companies within a sector, industry, or portfolio, should be reliable, verifiable, and objective, should be provided on a timely basis. Why is it important? Let's go through a very quick example. So, for example, we have a corporation that is listed on an exchange, and every year it reports its financial stance, and it also provides its major risks. And for various reasons, the managers of the corporation might want to hide certain information. And with these standards, which are voluntary, but the regulators from around the world, they read those recommendations and might implement those in national law. By doing this, the corporations are, in a way, they don't have a choice. They just have to follow these principles. If everyone in the market knows about those principles, when someone reads such a report, they know, did the corporation follow those rules? And if we have this kind of transparency, then the possibility of hiding certain information or manipulating certain information or being involved in any kind of fraud in terms of information, this would be visible very, very quickly. Implementation path. So 5-year time frame from 2018. So we have the report released, then companies already reporting under other frameworks, implement the task force's recommendations, other consider climate-related issues within their business. So there are standards, global standards for disclosure of information, and the idea is to incorporate those new standards, and the existing standard setters, they are also incorporating the recommendations from the task force. So this is becoming becoming a global standard, right? Organizations begin to disclose in financial filings climate-related issues viewed as mainstream business and investment considerations by both users and preparers. Greater adoption, further development of information provided, and greater maturity in using information, then more complete, consistent, and comparable information for market participants, increased transparency and appropriate pricing of climate-related risk and opportunities, broad understanding of the concentration of carbon-related assets in the financial system and the financial system's exposure to climate-related risks. So the idea is to slowly arrive at a point when where all of the information, the climate-related information, would be properly disclosed to the market participants, so to the investors, regulators, other corporations, so that the global financial industry is transparent about the climate risks. I suggest we can take 1 minute break, maybe, because it's already 6 past 6. And after this 1 minute, we come back. I will grab some more water if you don't mind. Okay. Okay. I believe we can start. Okay, thank you, Arnaud. So let's talk about the United Nations Environment Program Finance Initiative. So this finance initiative was established at Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit in 1992. And this is a platform associating the United Nations and the financial sector globally. The UN Environment Program Financial Initiative facilitates cooperation and knowledge sharing among global financial actors, including investment banks and asset managers. It estimates that around 50% of the value of a representative global market portfolio could be at risk in the transition to a low carbon economy. There will be a significant share of stranded assets, assets that suffer from unanticipated or premature write-downs, devaluations, or conversion to liabilities. So something that I already discussed with you before. So there is a big issue of, for example, coal mines, fossil fuel powered plants, diesel cargo ships, etc. 15% of the value of a representative global market portfolio. So that's a huge amount. This huge amount of asset of a great value, and this will cause significant disturbance to the market, and it will cause volatility to many high volatility to many markets, and devaluation of many assets, and change in prices on many markets. So what UN Environment Program Finance Initiative is involved in. Down below, you have an example of one of their reports, Navigating New Climate, Assessing Climate Risk and Opportunity. And here, 16 banks from around the world gathered in order to develop methodology, risk methodology, in this case, physical risk methodology, and work on physical risk scenarios and how changes in physical risk might affect the agriculture and energy sector portfolios and real estate sector portfolios. And thanks to this cooperation, new methodology is created, and banks are allowed to actually understand what is their exposure to physical risks in the space of agricultural energy sector and real estate portfolio. So out of these methodologies, we know that property values might be affected at coastal locations, that there will be a decrease in sector productivity, the agricultural sector productivity in regions affected by desertification, lack of water, higher temperature. This would affect the revenues and cost of goods sold, and this will also have an effect on the probability of default. One important thing to mention at this stage is that in terms of physical risks, it's not that this is the first time that the financial industry is dealing with such risks. In the previous decades, it was mainly the insurance industry that dealt with physical risks, because that was the idea of their business. Right now, however, with the new knowledge and with the new findings about climate and how things will progress, it is also the asset managers and banks that are interested in how these risks will affect their portfolios, because they are providing funding, they are facilitating in terms of investment banks the provision of capital to many firms, and within their portfolio they have real estate, they have agricultural producers, and they also have the energy sector, firms from the energy sector, so those who extract, those who mine, but also those who produce energy. And this, you might think, for example, with nuclear power, you might think that it's easy to switch to nuclear power, but it might not be the case with climate change, because with nuclear power, you also need certain climate conditions. You need water to cool down the reactors, and it might not be the case in every part of the world that you can get this cold water. So there are a lot of risks, a lot of issues, and this now is being analyzed. The next slide is on the network for greening the financial system. So this is one of the more important groups in terms of climate risks and dealing with climate risk by the financial sector. It is a group of central banks and financial supervisors willing to contribute to the analysis and management of climate and environment-related risks in the financial sector, and to mobilize mainstream finance to support the transition toward a sustainable economy. At the beginning, it was formed of 8 institutions, and down below you can see that 5 of them actually came from Europe, which also stresses the role of Europe and European Union in dealing with climate change and climate risk. The Bank of England, the Bank of France, and the Central Bank of the Netherlands. The Bank of France and the Central Bank of Netherlands, they are the one of pioneers in research on climate risk. The Deutsche Bundesbank, the Swedish FSA, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, the People's Bank of China. In the last 2 years, there was an influx of members. Currently, there are 83 members and 13 observers. So the purpose of the Ngfs is to define and promote the implementation of best practices within Ngfs and outside, and to develop analytical work on green finance. Its work is to build on a range of national and international initiatives responding to the financial risks and opportunities stemming from climate and environment related changes, such as the TCFD that we already discussed, the G20 Green Sustainable Finance Study Group, as well as broader international activities such as the Paris Agreement that we discussed, and the Sustainable Development Goals. So if you're not aware, this is a set of 17 sustainable development goals. Most of the countries in the world signed signed the Sustainable Development Goals and officially committed to reaching those goals by 2030. The European Union is fairly serious about reaching those. Of course, the European Union is starting from a completely different point, because we can say that all of the European Union countries are developed countries, and the issues that that face the societies, the Sustainable Development Goals, they actually reflect the problems of the developing world. So the developing countries are those who would benefit more from reaching those Sustainable Development Goals. So what's going on within the Ngfs? It's good to know. So the activity falls within 5 major work streams. The first one is the microprudential and supervision. So far, we don't see any official regulation in this space. This group is working on keeping track of supervisory developments and update the mapping of supervisory practices for integrating climate-related and environmental risks into micro-prudential supervision, considering the extent to which a financial risk differential exists between green and other assets, reviewing and assessing existing methodologies to measure climate-related and environmental financial risks at micro level. So how these groups work? So there are members from various institutions who are part of the Ngfs, and they work together on these topics. So again, when we see some changes to financial regulation, it might the idea might come from above. So it might come from the Financial Stability Board or from such organizations as the Ngfs. So the work done there then gets translated into regulation at national levels. Then macro financial, developing climate scenarios for central banks and supervisors. So this is something that I'm dealing with from a standpoint of an investment bank. We receive those scenarios and we have to deal with those scenarios. So this is something I directly work with, and this is a space that is developing pretty fast right now. I will talk about PRA, who already set a number of climate scenarios that banks need to run. So in terms of development, this is one of the more developed areas. Then providing guidance to central banks and supervisors on integrating climate risk analysis into macroeconomic and financial stability surveillance, seizing the macro financial impact of climate-related risks. Then scaling up green finance, promoting the adoption of sustainable and responsible principles in central banks' investment approaches, understanding and monitoring the market dynamics of green finance. So, for example, the green bond market, the green loan market, how these are developing. There are certain goals set by the international community, and the question is the world reaching those goals, and what are the obstacles on the way to reaching those goals? Providing a joint central bank's view on the various challenges climate change raises for the conduct of monetary policy. So we already have some statements on this, again, mainly by PRA, EBA, recently by the Fed in the US. So things are changing fast in this space. Bridging the data gaps, identifying a list of data items needed for the purpose of the Ngfs work streams, determining the availability, the sources and limitations for accessing the relevant data, producing a public list of missing data items and calling external stakeholders to bridge it. And finally, research, updating the list of Ngfs research questions on a regular basis in relation with the other Ngfs work streams, ensuring a smooth coordination of research efforts with the Ngfs working structures, developing the relationship with the Ngfs research stakeholders. So to sum up, the network for greening the financial system, this is a group of central banks and financial authorities, regulation authorities, working together on the topic of climate change, climate risks, and a lot of things that will appear within financial regulation will actually first be born within their research. So it's worth following their publications. European Commission. So action plan on sustainable finance. This connects well with this directly connects with the European Green New Deal. In 2015, the European Union and its individual members all signed the Paris Agreement and the UN 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and something that I mentioned already. In order to fulfill its commitments, the EU's European Commission appointed a high-level expert group on sustainable finance. On January 31st, 2018, the expert group published its final report offering a comprehensive vision on how to build a sustainable finance strategy for the EU. The report argues that sustainable finance is about two imperatives: improving the contribution of finance to sustainable and inclusive growth by funding society's long-term needs, and second, strengthening financial stability by incorporating environmental, social, and governance factors into investment decision making. So what is the European Commission doing? It plans the issue of climate risk into the wider notion of ESG factors, and it plans to tackle the climate risk issue within this broader scope. So it will not be only about climate risk, but it will take a much broader view. The EC's action plan on sustainable finance builds upon the group's recommendations to set out an EU strategy for sustainable finance. Action areas, there are three main areas: reorienting capital flows towards a more sustainable economy. So the general problem of what steps to take in order for capital to flow towards a more sustainable economy, as you can see from the previous slides, the market started to act on its own. So for example, the BlackRock, the asset managers, they are also trying to predict what's going on, and they are taking action ahead of action taken by the regulators. And this capital flow will gain momentum, right? So more and more capital will flow towards a sustainable economy. Of course, there are questions on how to facilitate this. Then mainstreaming sustainability in risk management. So far, the majority of financial institutions, private financial institutions, they do not have much expertise on climate risk and sustainability. So this is a growing area, and this will need to be addressed by the financial industry. When we talk about risk management, and we come back to the slide on the TCFD, you saw this this graphic with governance, risk management. So what needs to change in order to facilitate for sustainability, climate issues? So one of the areas that need to change is the risk management. So to facilitate this area for climate, for climate risk. Then transparency, fostering transparency and long-termism. So again, this comes to TCFD, transparency in terms of actually sharing the real risks, climate risks that a particular firm is exposed to, and reporting those risks to the internal actors, but also to other stakeholders. So, in order to make climate risk something transparent, something that everyone can have a look at and talk about. Then components of these three main areas: a unified classification system for sustainable activities, standards and labels for sustainable financial products. Big questions like, you have a green bond, what defines a green bond, right? So there are a lot of questions in this area, and the regulators are working on it. Fostering investment in sustainable projects, sustainability considerations in financial advice. So, for example, investment banks are advising their clients, so sustainability should be taken into account while providing the financial advice. There are also regulations around that, either in place or being created right now. It also connects with the legal risk. Because the general idea is that any corporation or a financial institution should reveal any major risks that it faces. And climate risk is considered very often as one of those major risks. So even in a situation when there is lack of direct climate risk regulations, since they are major risks, they should be revealed, and there are also questions by managers on what risks, what information to report, to actually mention and work on. Sustainability benchmarks. Then, if under mainstreaming, sustainability in market research and credit ratings. So credit ratings, green credit ratings. How do we know that a certain corporation is a green firm, is an eco-friendly firm? So that's why we need those ratings. A lot of things are developing in this space. Institutional investors and asset managers, sustainability duties, prudential requirements for banks and insurance companies. Then disclosure and accounting, corporate governance, and undue capital market short-termism. So that's another topic of corporate governance. How the standards will evolve, how the guidelines will evolve. There are guidelines from the International Bank of Settlements. The International Bank of Settlements provides guidelines on corporate governance, and this the notion of climate risk and climate change will certainly, and the notion of ESG factors will certainly be addressed soon. So that's a snapshot incorporating sustainability and prudential requirements. Let me go to the next slide. European banking authorities. What is the European Banking Authority doing? So the Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, the EBA's Action Plan on Sustainable Finance directly follows the European Commission's action plan for the same. The EBA's remit and mandates on ESG factors and ESG risks are set out in the following legislative acts. So there are also questions on what is the basis for certain institutions to take action on certain topics. Here for the EBA, this has been resolved, and there are 4 legislative acts that solve this issue. So the amended EBA regulation, revised capital requirements regulation, and capital requirements directive, new investment firms regulation and investment firms directive, Commission's action plan, financing sustainable growth, and related legislative packages. Why is it so important for EBA? EBA is the bank of the majority of European Union economies, and one of the countries could ask, but on what legal basis are they, for example, imposing a stress test on climate risks? And by solving these issues, the bank might be able in the future to run official stress tests, climate-related stress tests. It's laid down in the EBA's founding regulation. The EBA has to take into account sustainable business models and the integration of ESG factors when acting within its scope of action and when carrying out its tasks. The EBA should also develop a monitoring system to assess material ESG risks, taking into account the Paris Agreement. In addition, the EBA should develop common methodologies for assessing the effect of economic scenarios and on institutions' financial position, taking into account inter alia risks stemming from adverse environmental developments. So with this kind of description, it is more than sure that European Banking Authority will take regulatory action on climate change and climate risk and the ESG factors. So EBA will follow the sequence reflected in its mandate, which can be summarized as strategy and risk management, something we discussed, key metrics and disclosure, stress testing and scenario analysis, something that I alluded to, and prudential treatment. The EBA encourages institutions to adapt climate change related scenarios and use scenario analysis as an explorative tool to understand the relevance of the exposures affected by and the potential magnitude of physical risks and transition risks. So for the time being, there are no stress tests that affect capital requirements of the major banks, but this might change in the next years. So one day, climate risk might stress tests on climate risk might be part of the capital requirement stress testing. So what the banks are doing right now, they are preparing preparing their capacity in order to run such scenarios and also adjusting methodologies for doing that. I will speak about it in the section on PRA. Okay, we still have some time for that. So milestones for EBA regulatory mandates on sustainable finance. So it started in Q4 2019. EBA response to call for advice on short-termism. The notion of short-termism is that the majority of financial institutions, they are very focused on short-term profits. So how to address that, how to make the financial industry look more into the future. And there are various ways for doing that, various regulations for doing that, including regulations around and standards around corporate governance, but also regulations in terms of taxing profit and these kind of things. Discussion paper 2020, consultation paper. So you see that so far in terms of sustainable finance, things are in the consultation phase. So no official requirements. 2021 final draft, final report, and then discussion paper 2022-24, possible update of relevant EBA guidelines or new guidelines, and final report by 2025. So the final report on sustainable finance by 2025, and until that moment, there should be no, I would say, no regulations that would impact, for example, capital requirements. So these will be new exercises, new information to digest by the financial sector, but no capital requirements should come before 2025. And now the Bank of England. So the Bank of England is the protagonist in climate-related financial regulation. So it's ahead of everyone in the world. The second, I would say, the second is the bank, the European Banking Authority, the Monetary Policy Authority, the Monetary Policy Authority of Singapore, Japan to some extent, China, recently joined by Fed, but PRA, Bank of England is the first right now. So the Bank of England's response to climate-related financial risks has two core elements, each motivated by its statutory objectives in its respective functions as. So the function of the Prudential Regulatory Authority under BOE. Its objective is to promote safety and soundness of the firms it regulates by enhancing their approach to managing climate-related risks. So to any risks, but also to climate-related risks. So this is how PRA interprets its mandate. Then the Financial Policy Committee, it identifies, monitors, and takes action to remove or reduce systemic risks with a view to protecting and enhancing the resilience of the UK financial system. It also supports the economic policy of the UK government. So thanks to the research done by EOE, the BOE, the Financial Policy Committee, now knows that climate risk might actually become a systemic risk at some point. So this is why climate risk is also considered as a potential systemic risk to the UK financial sector. In April 2019, the PRA set out its expectations of banks and insurers in a supervisory statement, enhancing the banks and insurers' approaches to managing the financial risks from climate change. We will walk through this document very quickly, read through the main points, and try to see what's the PRA's understanding and how they approach climate change in their supervisory statement. So, climate change and society's response to it present financial risks which are relevant to the PRA's objectives mentioned above. While the financial risks from climate change may crystallize in full over longer time horizons, they are also becoming apparent now. While firms are enhancing their approaches to managing the financial risk from climate change, few firms are taking a strategic approach that considers how actions today affect future financial risks. So PRA is alluding to what's going on right now with climate risk in the financial sector, and it wants to stress this issue of climate change and climate risk to the firms right now. The magnitude of the financial risks from climate-related factors will depend on future scenarios that will, at least in part, be determined by actions taken today. The financial risks from climate change have a number of distinctive elements which, when considered together, present unique challenges and require strategic... Sorry? Okay. Present unique challenges and require strategic approach to financial risk management. These elements include complexity of the risk. So climate risk is non-linear. There are a lot of correlations, and it's irreversible. So we cannot come back to a certain point in time. Uncertain and extended time horizons, no historical data available. So the risk management function will have to face in its methodology a risk that has not materialized or has not materialized to a large extent in the previous years. The most of models are based on historical data in risk management. So this will be a forward-looking exercise. Highly disruptive outcome of the risk. So if the risk hits, it will have a really, really disruptive effect on the market. That's why and if this risk hits a large number of firms in the industry, then we would talk about a systemic risk. Dependency on short-term actions to minimize negative consequences of risk outcomes. So certain actions have to be taken today, and only in long in the future the results will be seen. So if we take some preventive action today, we might not see any outcome for many years. The risk manager or the CEO who took those actions today might be long away from the corporation. New people will be there, and they will actually be bearing the outcome of the action taken by those who left. A little too late scenario could result in the most severe financial risks materializing in the banking and insurance sectors. Here, Bank of England alludes to three scenarios developed by the Ngfs, so the network for greening the financial system. And one of the options is that the world, the global industry, financial industry, and all of the actors, global actors, they take action too late, and they do too little, and under such circumstances, we will see the most severe financial risks materializing. Financial risk from climate change will be minimized if there is an orderly market transition to a low carbon world, but the window for an orderly transition is finite and closing. So the PRA is alluding that action should be taken right now, and it should be taken right now, but it should be taken gradually. So there should not be any sharp change to policy, but it should start right now and gradually move to a point in the future. Okay, the PRA expects a firm's response to the financial risk from climate change to be proportionate to the nature, scale, and complexity of its business. PRA approaches the challenge of climate change in a strategic way, treating climate risk on par with other major risk categories such as market, credit, operational, or legal. The PRA intends to embed the measurement and monitoring of these expectations into its supervisory framework. What the supervisory framework consists of, it consists of 8 elements. The first one is governance. Board responsibilities. The PRA expects a firm's board to understand and assess the financial risk from climate change that affect the firm and be able to address and oversee these risks within the firm's overall business strategy and risk appetite. Second one is risk management. The PRA expects firms to address the financial risk from climate change through the existing risk management frameworks in line with their board-approved risk appetite, while recognizing that the nature of these risks requires a strategic approach. In a manner proportionate to their business, firms should identify, measure, monitor, manage, and report on their exposure to these risks. Firms should be able to evidence this in their written risk management policies, management information, and board risk reports. This includes, where appropriate, updating existing risk management policies. So quite a lot to do in the risk management space. Then risk identification and measurement. The PRA expects firms to understand the financial risk from climate change and how they will affect their business model. So take climate risks seriously, provide resources, develop knowledge and understanding among risk managers. Firms should use scenario analysis and stress testing to inform the risk identification process and understand the short and long-term financial risks to their business models, climate change. So scenario analysis should be used for the risk management purposes, but also in order to inform the board and the strategy of the firm on what risks actually lay ahead for the corporation. Firms are also expected to go beyond using only historical data to inform their risk assessment, for example, by considering future trends in catastrophe modeling. So this comes from the insurance industry. The PRA expects that such scenario will develop and mature over time. Such scenarios will develop and mature over time as firms learn from experience and each other. As part of the internal capital adequacy assessment process or own risk and solvency assessment, firms should include at a minimum all material exposures relating to the financial risks from climate change and an assessment of how firms have determined the material exposures in the context of their business. The next one, risk monitoring. Where appropriate, the PRA expects firms to consider a range of quantitative and qualitative tools and metrics to monitor exposures to financial risk from climate change. And for example, these could be used to monitor exposures to climate-related risk factors, which could result from changes in the concentration of firms' investment or lending portfolios, or to the potential impact of physical risk factors on outsourcing arrangements and supply chains, the PRA expects that these metrics and tools will evolve and mature over time as firms gain experience. So PRA keeps on reiterating that it does not expect firms to have the full sort of expertise on the climate risk issues, but it expects firms to gradually develop the expertise. Risk management and mitigation, where the potential impacts of the financial risks from climate change are assessed to be material, the PRA expects firms to evidence how they will mitigate these financial risks and to have credible plan or policies in place for managing exposures. So for example, if a large bank runs scenario analysis and it finds out that the portfolio that it runs today, the structure of the portfolio that it runs today might be in danger in for example 15 or 20 years time, then PRA expects actions to be taken and description of those actions. Risk reporting and management information, PRA expects firms to provide the board and relevant subcommittees with management information on their exposure to the financial risk from climate change based on scenario analysis and the mitigating actions as associated timeframe the firm proposes to take. Scenario analysis where appropriate, the PRA expects firms to conduct scenario analysis to inform the strategic planning and determine the impact of the financial risk from climate change on their overall risk profile and business strategy. Scenario analysis should also be used to explore the resilience and vulnerabilities of a firm's business model to a range of outcomes. So the outcomes of these analysis, they should be provided to senior management, to the board, and the whole firm should be involved in analyzing the outcome of those scenarios. The PRA expects a firm's scenario analysis to address a range of outcomes relating to different transition paths to a low carbon economy and a path where no transition occurs. The scenario analysis should, where appropriate, include short-term assessment, which sets out the firm's exposure to the financial risk from climate change within its existing business planning horizon, including, where appropriate, the quantification of these risks, longer-term assessment of the firm's exposure based on its current business model and a range of different climate-related scenarios. The PRA expects firms to use these scenarios to understand the impact of the financial risks from climate change on their solvency, liquidity, and for ensures their ability to pay policy holders. The PRA considers ORSA for insurers and ICAP for banks to be useful frameworks within which to consider the financial risk from climate change. For banks, for SS, on the ICAP sets out that scenario analysis should be used to explore the sensitivities in longer-term business plans. Scenario analysis is a key tool that the PRA expects firms to employ as part of that assessment. PRA expects a firm's scenario analysis to address a range of outcomes relating to different transition paths to a low-carbon economy and a path where no transition occurs. So here they point to the set of scenarios that should be analyzed. The scenario analysis should, where appropriate, include short-term assessment, long-term assessment. So this is something I already read. Disclosure: banks and insurers have existing requirements to disclose information on material risks within the Pillar 3 disclosures and on principles, risks, and uncertainties in their strategic report. Firms should recognize the increasing possibility that disclosure will be mandated in more jurisdiction and prepare accordingly. So this links to the TCFD, the recommendations, the standards that they create, and that these recommendations might actually be part of jurisdiction of law in certain places. The PRA expects firms to consider engaging with the TCFD framework and other initiatives in developing their approach to climate-related financial disclosures. Just to finish, we have one more interesting document to go through. So this is the first stress testing exercise. This will be an exploratory scenario, so no, it will not have an impact on capital requirements, but the major UK banks are obliged to take part in these exercises, in this exercise. So this is the 2021 biannual exploratory scenario on the financial risk from climate change. Climate change presents financial risk for banks, insurers, and the wider financial system. It is therefore relevant to the bank's objectives for financial stability and the safety and soundness of the regulated firms. Measuring the financial risk from climate change is complex. It involves assessing the effect of multiple pathways with different physical and transition effects over several decades. This requires new tools and approaches to measure and understand risks. So again, climate change presents financial risk via physical risks, transition risks. In the UK, loan exposures to fossil fuel producers, energy utilities, and emission-intensive sectors amount to 70% of the largest UK banks' common equity Tier 1 capital. So this is one of the reasons this exercise is being run right now. For UK insurance, around 12% of equity and 8% of corporate bond portfolio exposures are in high carbon technologies. So something that will probably disappear in the next in the next 2 decades. So we will not see those technologies anymore. The window for an orderly transition to a carbon neutral economy is finite and closing. To keep global average temperature increases below 2 degrees Celsius, the business models of many companies and the structure of the overall economy need to change significantly. The financial system has exposures to many counterparties and sectors that are not aligned with the Paris Agreement target. Purpose of this exercise, BOE complements its annual cyclical stress test by using exploratory scenarios to explore a range of risks that may not neatly link to prevailing economic or financial conditions. These exercises help the bank and financial institutions prepare for possible future risks. The BES will test the resiliency of the UK financial system to the physical and transition risks associated with different climate pathways. This is the desired outcomes, sees the financial exposures of participating firms and the financial system more broadly to climate-related risks, understand the challenges to participants' business model from these risks, assist participants in enhancing their management of climate-related financial risks. The exercise will not be used to set capital requirements, as I said. So the exercise will differ from traditional stress testing methodologies. As I already said, the methodologies differ for a number of reasons. So the key difference is the wide-ranging impact of climate-related financial risks, a wide range of possible pathways and climate outcomes requiring multiple scenarios, the interaction with the real economy requiring counterparty level analysis, much longer time frame for risk materialization requiring multi-decade analysis. So there will be 2 parts to this exercise: seizing the risk, stress testing the current balance sheets. So the idea is that we take the current balance sheet of a bank and we stressed it against a 30 years time horizon, and current approach is that we stress it against 5-year frequency. So today's balance sheet against 2025, against 2030, 35, 40, 45, and 50. And then the banks can draw a chart on how their portfolio value changes across the time and take action and try to understand what is causing the change in value of the portfolio at these points in time, and then run the analysis. So what firms is PRA covering? So large UK insurers, large UK banks. 3 scenarios, as I already mentioned. These scenarios are based on the Ngfs scenarios. Early policy action, so there's a lot of transition risk and not so much physical risk in the future, because a lot of climate issues are addressed right now. Then we have the late policy action, so we wait until 2030. Global GHG emissions increase by that time, and only by 2030 policy actions are taken, but they are much more severe to the ones taken right now. And the last one is the no additional policy action. So the world runs business as usual. There is no much no much concern, not much concern about the greenhouse gas emissions, about the climate science. It just continues as it is. Modeling, and so 30 years, the longest in regulatory stress testing, usually it's 3 years. Balance sheets to be assumed fixed over the time horizon, as I said, 5-year long reporting frequency, and there is an issue of data. Most of the stress tests are based on historical data. Here, it's a forward-looking scenario. Aggregated results would set out system-level metrics detailing the financial sector's exposure to climate change, the main sources of loss by sector, and geography. Let's have a quick look at these 3 scenarios. I already described them, but let's see illustrative variable pathways in each scenario. So let's look at carbon price and time. What happens in the early policy action? What happens in the late policy action? There's an increase in carbon price. In early policy action, there is, for example, a quota or tax imposed on a carbon price, and then it decreases slightly up to the point where it's simply not profitable to use oil or carbon. It's just too expensive. Late policy action, so we continue with no tax, then we impose a sharp tax. So it hits those using fossil fuels very much, and with no additional policy action, this price will just follow the market trend. So no external stress to the price. Emissions. So GHGs. The idea is to reduce them as much as possible, up to net zero, like in the case of Europe. In the early policy action, we take some measures. We put quotas on emissions, and it slowly goes down. With the late policy action, you can see that it follows the current path, but then we have a sudden change in policy, so increase in transition risks, high disruption to the markets. But eventually, we achieve what we want, so a reduction in emissions. With BAU, emissions just fall, and the climate change phenomenon, the reaction, the global warming, the reaction of global warming just keeps on going, increases. Temperature change, with no additional policy action, the temperature keeps on rising. With late policy action and early policy action, the temperature will keep on rising because this is unavoidable. All the models say that the only thing we can do right now is to limit the temperature increase, but we will face the temperature increase. So the question is, at what point the temperature increase will stop? Will it stop at 1.5? Will it stop at 2? What are the sort of long-term consequences of what we have already done as a civilization? This is not sure, but certainly a lot of climate effects will just take place no matter what we do. And the last one, so scenario specification, the update on the bank's approach to the climate biennial exploratory scenario in selected areas provides a list of climate-related and macro-financial variables. So what's specific about climate scenarios is that in addition to macro-financial variables that are used in models today, the financial industry will have to accommodate the climate variables. And here you can see the transition risk variables. A few of those I can read out loud: greenhouse gas emissions by sector, cropland in million hectares, total primary energy transportation capacity, etc. So these variables, they have not been used in the financial, especially in the banking industry. Some of those in the insurance industry, but not in the banking industry. And then we have the physical risk variables: temperature, flood risk, storm surge, sea level rise, severe weather, storm, drought, heat waves, wildfire risk, impact on agricultural yields. So these two sets of new climate variables, transition risk variables and physical risk variables, will need to be adjusted by the models, and this is the work that is running right now at the banks. Okay, thank you very much. I have not given much time for the Q&A, unfortunately, but for those who can stay, we can still have a discussion.
Thank you very much, Tomasz. So I hope some of you have questions for Tomasz. So if you want to raise your voice, if you have any points that you would like to comment or ask a question, so that would be the time to do that. Anyone? You can just speak out. No? Okay. Yeah, so for me, I would have like a question about like the fact that this scenario and this stress testing also, I think we'll have a follow-up session also with you, Tomasz, about like how they could be like implemented and what it means in more detail, so that I think it will be the opportunity to go a bit more in details how the stress testing, what it means, in fact, also for the financial sector. But beyond the financial sector, I think like corporates will have also to follow through. And I think for students or even for executives, that's very interesting also to follow this process, which is coming quite late, in fact. I mean, if we look at the history of climate change, I mean, we've been discussing about it, but we are still building now. We are only building up like regulations and stress testing and so on now, and we see that we are lagging behind also in terms of data. I mean, how we can set the right data. I think in terms of accounting system just for the greenhouse gas emissions, there are still like discussion how to get a global system to agree about how you check and you monitor your greenhouse gas. We know that each of us is producing like something like 8 tons per year, but it's not something that we are monitoring as such as individual, but maybe at some point we will have to monitor our greenhouse gas emissions and know exactly how much we are producing. But my question is whether you when you look at like what the Banking of England is doing, are they also like looking at the impact of like the current pandemic also on this transition? Because if you look at like the digitalization of the society, of the economy, it's accelerating and it's changing. I mean, whether or not the pandemic will stop in 6 months, 1 year, and so on, we know that the digitalization is increasing. At the same time, we saw that it could have also a negative impact on the climate change. So how far digitalization and the pandemic is taken into account in this stress testing?
So in terms of pandemic and technological change, there are no official stress tests by the regulators. So this is something that is done internally. So these are called internal scenarios, and these are run for within the banks. And of course, here with the pandemic, the bank used scenario. Of course, first of all, that was something to a large extent unexpected, right? So it's hard to say if there was a financial institution in the world fully prepared for the pandemic. But fortunately, the disruption to the market was not, I would say the realized disruption was not above the models already used for different kinds of shocks. So this was not something that would cause a major disruption to the financial industry. Of course, you can think of risks that correlate with the pandemic. So what would happen in the longer term, and it will probably not come from the pandemic itself, but you might have a lot of credit risk, a lot of issues with debt, corporate debt, household debt. So these things will certainly evolve. Of course, you have the state emergency funds given to many corporates and households would diminish these risks. But answering your question, there are no specific stress tests, official stress tests on something like a pandemic. This is a short-term sort of shock that has been withstood by the majority of the financial system. In terms of technology, this is something that is also being addressed throughout the years, because we have growing technology since the beginning of the computer era. So there are various scenarios on this. But again, these are things that you can, to a large extent, you can foresee. When you have talks about the strategy, business model, how should certain firms position themselves against, for example, the fintech, right? So the financial the financial firms, so the new financial firms, internet-based financial firms. So this is something that the banks can prepare for. In terms of climate risk, I think that the main difference is that this is a big gradual change throughout a very long time horizon. And one of the reasons you ask a good question, why it took so long, for the global politics, and also for the financial industry to realize that this is a real threat. So you have some answer in this history of meetings that at the beginning, and it's probably with a lot of different aspects of everyday life, that for at the beginning it's mainly about the scientists talking about something. It takes 10-20 years before it reaches the public, and then there's the question of the politicians picking the topic. The issue of climate change has been mainly political, so it just took a lot of time and effort in order for the global diplomacy to arrive at any kind of agreement. As you can see, the disputes between the US and Europe, they lasted for more than 30 years. And the Copenhagen Accord, which was created by US, and then the Paris Accord, that was the Paris Agreement, that was based on the Copenhagen Accord. It was the US itself that decided to withdraw from this agreement. So it's politics. That's why it takes long. And with the topic of climate change itself, what it means that it has been picked right now, it means that it's a serial issue. So if you see the financial industry being serious about something, it means it's real, right? So if BlackRock says, without any enforcement from financial regulations, that it's time to move away from fossil intensive industry and go to net zero economy, it means that the world has to do it, right? So it means that there is really an issue, right? And now we have this momentum after 2015. The public is talking about it. people are getting interested. People read the models, read the data, the science, and more and more actors are convinced that there is really an issue. But every time when you run this kind of exercise like stress testing, there is quite a lot of things to do around this. So building expertise, providing resources for this, and it takes time. So answering your question, why it didn't happen before, it was probably it was simply not on the priority list. There was always something more important. There were always resources needed for other things. And now when the financial industry realized that it's a real topic, and the financial regulators announced that they will take the topic seriously, suddenly you see the funds and the resources and the willingness to tackle this issue. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. Anyone else has a question?
Maybe from my side, thank you very much, Tomasz, for all these detailed information you gave. I fully share Arnaud's view that we are a bit slow. If you consider that our decade is dubbed a decade of delivery for the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, the overarching idea related to all what you said today is to ensure that the financial industry makes sure that funds are channeled away from the brown towards the green industry. Now, when I hear you say that the European Banking Authority is working on a report due in 4 years, what is your personal view? How much time will it take from the financial architecture to be ready until this transformation is done, that the real economy, the brown part of the real economy, is really drying up?
Right. So the one question is why it takes so long for institutions to deal with things. So one thing is that this topic has not been tackled before. So it has not been tackled. It was not on the priority list, and once the workings begun, just people realize how much has to be developed in this area. There's a massive amount of things to be developed. In terms of modeling, as I showed you in the last slide, except for insurance industry dealing with physical risks, the major financial industry, the major institutions have not worked with such models, and it would be very difficult to work with such models. You might say, why has not somebody worked on the data before? Because you also need resources for data provision. So these things are just being built up, and you need resources for these things. You need resources for people to collect data. In terms of climate risks, it's going to be difficult because the problem of climate risk is very regional. So you need very detailed data from various regions of the world. From Africa, for example, from Asia. Who is going to pay for the data provision in the middle of Africa? Do you expect the financial regulator of Congo to provide data? Probably not. So there are many questions of what to base these models on. And if we are dealing with large funds, great value, then we need some kind of quantitative proof for that. And for that, we need the outcome of the model, right? And for the models to work, we need data. We need data, and we need advanced modeling. So and in order to do that, we need resources and a lot of work. So the good thing is that the financial regulators are stepping in. it's very similar to the monetary policy. So sometimes it's more important what the central bank announces instead to what really happens. So the market adjusts to announcements. And I think we should not be too worried about the EBA's final report being ready in about 4 or 5 years' time, because up until that moment, the market will change itself significantly because it has to adapt. So a good example of this is, for example, with LIBOR. Some of you are aware that there will be no official LIBOR from that year. And a lot of financial products in the world used to be based on LIBOR, a massive amount. And
just to explain maybe to the audience, LIBOR is the London rate. So it's an average rate of the bank when they are lending between themselves. So it's basically, if you want, like the basic rate that is used also later on by corporates for lending and so on. So that's often used also for loans. So the loans is based on LIBOR plus X% and so on when you do a rate or lending for a loan, for example. So there has been like a big scandal on the calculation of this rate, and now it's removed from market operation. It's no more used as a reference for the lending. So just to explain a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Arnaud, and sorry for not explaining it straight away. But with this one, so it was announced only 4 years ago that there will be no official LIBOR, and suddenly all of the major financial institutions, all of the financial institutions in the world had to find a way out from this. So invested huge funds in finding a way to move from LIBOR to different financial benchmarks. So invested in a lot in analysis, but also those who deal with legal risk, because there is quite a lot of legal risk on how the contracts were created, right? If there was a possibility of switching to a different benchmark. So within those 4 years, there was a massive change in the market. So there was a massive move, and with these climate risk scenarios, you can expect to a large extent the same kind of reaction. But just by stating there will be something ahead and something will become important, the financial industry will adjust. And of course, you have other policies. You have policies that do not cover the financial system. You have the government policies. You have the simple change in behavior of customers and communities. There are more and more customers who just do not want to be involved in any way with firms who are only involved in these brown assets and brown technology. So it's good that this move started, and I think that it will just the momentum will increase, and eventually we will see the change. Of course, there is a question if it's not too late from the climate science perspective. As I said, most of the models say that we will see the temperature rise anyways. We can do everything to diminish it, to decrease it, but eventually we will see that. And also there are many other environmental issues that are omitted when talking about climate change. We had the ocean acidification. There is no model right now takes into account model acidification, but this might be a major problem with loss of life in ocean because of the ocean acidification. So there are a lot of things, a lot of questions, but I think that the world is set to become much less fossil fuel intensive in the future, and the developed countries will just follow with this new technologies and this new strategy. And just by default, the rest of the world will follow the richest countries of the world, because this is how things work. There is not much you cannot really be a lonely island with your own policies and ideas, because it's also the case of Poland. Poland wanted to build a coal-fired plant, but they couldn't find anyone to invest in this, and nobody to provide a technology for this plant, because this technology is already gone. Nobody invests in it. So even if you want to do something, you are limited already by the market, and I think that this will continue. This will continue. So I'm optimistic, maybe not too optimistic about the final outcomes in terms of climate science, but optimistic in terms of the change on the market. I cannot hear you. Arnaud?
Thank you very much, Thomas. And I think it's the point is also that there are a lot of actions and a lot of work also for the new generation to do. I think in the future, in terms of fighting climate change, not only like let's say in trading, also as we see in terms of legal, so for someone working also as a lawyer, for someone working as a physician, working in energy. I mean, I think the financial industry will have to open up also in terms of skills, because you may need also people who have like skills beyond the traditional financial skills to understand exactly the risk and the transformation. So thank you very much, Thomas. I think there will be like a follow-up later on where we will focus a bit more on stress testing, and we go through that a bit more in detail, so that we'll have like a zoom on this aspect, which is very important, and not only for the financial industry, but I think overall in any activities, we'll have to understand how to do stress testing in the context of climate change. All right, so I thank you all, and enjoy your evening, and talk to you, I think, next week, and have a good evening, everyone. Take care.
Thank you for joining. Thank you. Bye-bye. Thanks.
Bye.